I am Harold, 70 years old and still somehow mending from wounds that my own flesh and blood left behind. As a retired structural engineer, I gave my life to building things that wouldn't fall, never once suspecting that my own son was quietly engineering my ruin. 5 months after my wife passed, I brought her damaged smart glasses in for a routine repair. The technician bolted his shop doors, drew me into a back room, and leaned close. "Check the will right now before you are next." I stood there frozen as he played back the chilling video he had pulled from her glasses. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where ordinary men and women refuse to go quietly. If these stories of courage and justice speak to something deep in you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means more than you know. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What do you hope to carry with you from a story like this one? A warning, a reminder, a little fire? Tell me. Now, a quick note, some details in today's story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. It is the truth underneath the story that matters. Stress fractures, load-bearing walls, the hidden forces that make something solid suddenly give way. These are things I spent a career understanding. What I never saw coming was that my own family would be the structure I failed to inspect. I poured everything into Evelyn and our son Nate, his Ivy League degree, his lavish wedding to Iris, all of it bankrolled by me. I walked away into retirement certain the legacy I'd built would hold. 5 months ago, the whole thing gave way. Evelyn died. The doctor said it was a sudden, massive heart attack, the kind that strikes fast and leaves nothing to be done. A Tuesday evening. I was at a charity board meeting when it happened. I drove home to find the paramedics already standing with that look on their faces. Nate and Iris had been there with her. Their account was simple. She grabbed her chest, went down, and it was over in seconds. What could anyone have done? I told myself that. Death is the one collapse no structural engineer can brace against. I buried the grief and accepted the explanation. But I knew Evelyn had not been herself before she passed. Her memory had begun to slip. Keys left in odd places. Wrong turns on the same walk she'd taken for years. A growing frustration with a mind that no longer did what she asked of it. So I'd bought her a pair of custom smart glasses to help preserve what independence she still had. Designer frames on the outside, a discreet built-in camera on the inside set to log her daily routes and push the footage to a private cloud. If she ever got disoriented, she could pull up the recording and find her way back. The night she died, the paramedics collected her belongings and sealed them in a plastic bag. Her wedding ring, her watch, those glasses. The left lens was shattered from where she hit the floor. For months, that bag sat untouched. The weight of missing her made it impossible to go near anything that carried her absence. Then yesterday morning, something in me shifted. I finally opened it. I wanted the frames repaired, not to use, but to keep. So I drove over to a small electronics repair shop run by Eli Hartwell. I've known Eli since he was a teenager. When his father abandoned the family, I stepped in and helped cover his college tuition. He repaid that 100-fold by treating Evelyn and me like we were his own. A bell chimed when I pushed through the door of his shop. Eli glanced up from his bench and gave me a warm smile. I set the glasses down and told him what I needed. The broken lens swapped out, the internal memory cleared, and then I'd store them away somewhere safe. A simple job. But the instant his eyes landed on the serial number etched into the frame, the warmth left his face entirely. Something moved behind his expression that I couldn't read. He went pale. He scanned past my shoulder toward the front window as if he half expected someone to be watching from the street. Then, without a syllable, he stepped around me, turned the door sign to closed, dragged the security blinds down across the glass, and drove the deadbolt home. The sound it made, that solid final click, sat heavy in the air. "What's going on, Eli?" My voice came out clipped, tense. He took hold of my arm with a grip far stronger than I expected and walked me to his back room, the one lined with servers and equipment I'd never fully understood. The door closed behind us. The only light came from the blue-white glow of his monitors. He turned to face me, Evelyn's glasses cradled in hands that were literally trembling. "Mr. Vance," he said almost too quietly to hear, "you need to check your wife's will right now before you are next." The words landed but wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning. Before you are next. "What are you saying?" I asked. "What does that mean? What are you talking about?" He didn't respond with words. Instead, he sat at his terminal, fitted a specialized decryption cable into a port hidden along the frame, and his fingers went to work across the keyboard. He spoke while he typed. Weeks after Evelyn's death, he told me he'd done a routine pass through his cloud servers, the ones synced to her glasses. What he found stopped him cold. A massive corruption event time-stamped to the precise window of her death. Someone had pushed a remote wipe command targeting both the glasses and the cloud backup at the same moment, but they hadn't been careful enough. What they didn't know was that Eli had engineered a shadow directory into the hardware, a buried recovery layer invisible to anyone who hadn't built it themselves. He hit enter. On the screen, a progress bar began assembling broken data fragments into something coherent. I was able to pull the raw footage from the physical cache still inside the frames, he said, his voice dropping to barely a breath. I didn't know what to do with it. I've been too frightened to reach out. I had no idea who I could trust. Just watch. The monitor came alive. First-person footage shot from the camera bridged across Evelyn's nose. The timestamp matched her time of death exactly. The image shook, but it was sharp enough. I was seeing the world through my dead wife's eyes. Our kitchen. Her hands, thin, unsteady, moved toward the marble counter, searching for something to hold. Her breathing filled the audio, shallow, labored, each inhale a struggle, the sound of a body in the grip of acute heart failure. Then the camera lurched downward as she collapsed onto the hardwood. The left lens was shattered from where she hit the floor, and a jagged crack split the lower half of the frame. Through that fractured image, 2 pairs of shoes appeared. Italian leather loafers polished to a shine, designer heels alongside them. My chest tightened before the camera even tilted. Standing over my dying wife were Nate and Iris, perfectly still, not scrambling for a phone, not dropping to their knees beside her. Just standing there, watching her with a calm so complete it was obscene. Evelyn's body heaved with a desperate, rattling gasp. One arm lifted, weak and shaking, gesturing toward the countertop. Her voice barely made it out of her throat. The medicine, she managed. My pills. Iris moved. Her manicured hand closed around the small orange prescription bottle sitting on the counter, Evelyn's emergency cardiac medication. And then, with full knowledge of what she was holding, Iris turned away and kept the pills out of reach. Nate knelt down until his face filled the frame. My son, the one I'd raised, defended, sacrificed for staring into his mother's eyes as she lay dying, his expression as empty as a vacant lot. He leaned forward, his mouth opened, and then the footage detonated into static, a burst of digital wreckage, and the screen went dark. I didn't move. I wasn't breathing. The hum of the servers was the only sound in the room. That's where it ends, Eli said quietly. The impact had compromised the internal drive, and whoever sent that wipe command had taken the audio and the final moments with it. The encryption layers are deep. I've had recovery algorithms running for weeks. I need more time to reconstruct what's left, especially the audio, so we can hear what Nate actually said to her. My mind had no structure left. Every load-bearing beam of my understanding of reality had just buckled and fallen. Evelyn hadn't died. She had been killed. Killed by our son and his wife, who stood 2 feet away and let her suffocate while the medication that would have saved her sat in Iris's hand. And since then, they had been at every memorial, every family dinner, wearing their grief like a costume. My fists had closed without my realizing it. My knuckles were white. Why? Why would they do this? Check the will. Eli had told me before you are next. My phone rang. The sound cracked through the room like a beam snapping under load. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a name. Nate. I stood there looking at it. The man who had watched his mother die. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I said nothing. Hey, Dad. Nate's voice was all warmth and ease, that smooth, rehearsed register he used to close deals with clients. Iris and I are headed to your place right now. We're going to drive you over to the attorney's office so you can get those power of attorney documents signed. You've been a little forgetful lately, Dad. It's time to let us take the wheel on all of this. We'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call before I could get a single word out. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the darkened screen. The pieces locked together with a terrifying, merciless clarity. My son had murdered his mother, and now he was coming for me. I slid the phone into my pocket. The cold metal steadied me against the tempest tearing through my chest. I looked over at Eli. The young man had gone pale, his eyes wide with something close to dread. I placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder, a signal that I was completely in control. Keep working on decrypting the rest of that audio file, I told him, my voice dangerously level. Back everything up to a secure offline drive and don't pick up your phone for anyone but me. I will deal with my son. I pushed through the repair shop door and out into the sharp autumn air. I had exactly 15 minutes before they arrived. As a structural engineer, I had spent my entire 40-year career studying immense physical forces, calculating precisely how much sustained pressure a solid steel support beam could absorb before it finally gave way. I had to apply that same cold, unsparing logic to my own mind right now. The crushing grief and the white-hot rage could not be allowed to surface. I had to become the very thing they were certain I already was. A weak, bewildered, deeply grieving old man whose thoughts were slowly dissolving into fog. I let my shoulders sag forward, completely collapsing my posture. I deliberately slowed my breathing, shallow, slightly labored. I let the muscles of my face go slack, allowing a vacant, faraway expression to settle heavily over my features. Right on cue, a gleaming dark gray luxury sedan eased up to the curb. The heavily tinted passenger window slid down, and there was Nate in the driver's seat, both hands wrapped around the hand-stitched leather steering wheel. He wore a tailored navy suit, his hair immaculately groomed every inch, the wildly successful investment banker he sold to the world. Iris occupied the passenger seat, turning to offer me a bright, flawlessly rehearsed smile that made my stomach physically turn with revulsion. "Oh, Dad, we were so terribly worried about you," Iris cooed softly, pushing open her heavy car door and stepping onto the pavement to gently usher me inside. "Why are you walking around this part of town alone? You know how easily disoriented you get these days." I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached out to accept her arm. "I was just getting your mother's glasses fixed," I mumbled deliberately, blurring my words just enough to sell the performance. "I thought maybe she would want them back." Iris exchanged a quick, deeply telling glance with Nate, a look that screamed plainly the old man is losing his grip. She guided me gently into the back seat, handling me like a fragile piece of antique china, already hairline cracked under the pressure. Nate pulled the sedan smoothly away from the curb, folding into the heavy afternoon traffic without a hitch. He adjusted his rearview mirror just enough to lock eyes with me as he drove. He had always been a remarkably gifted talker, an absolute master at moving toxic financial instruments to wealthy clients who never knew what they were buying. Now he was applying those exact same boardroom tactics to his own father. "Dad, we really need to have a serious conversation about the future." Nate began, his tone thick with manufactured concern. "I was going over the estate documents with the legal team this morning. Mom's final medical bills are incredibly tangled. The hospital is sending invoices that make no sense, and the insurance company keeps giving us the runaround. It's turning into an enormous administrative burden for everyone involved." I gazed blankly out the tinted window, holding my expression carefully empty and unresponsive. "Bills," I whispered, sounding thoroughly distant and confused. "I can just write a check, Nate. There's plenty of money in the accounts. We don't need to worry about medical bills." "That's exactly the problem, Dad," Nate said smoothly, casually drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. "You have $40 million spread across trust accounts, real estate holdings, and liquid assets. It's a vast, highly complex portfolio. But without Mom here to legally co-manage things, the coming tax liabilities are going to be catastrophic. And honestly, Dad, Iris and I are growing deeply worried about you rattling around alone in that big house." "Worried about me?" I asked, threading a pathetic note of helpless confusion into my voice. Iris turned fully around in her seat, resting her perfectly manicured hand warmly on my knee. "Yes, Harold," she said softly. Her voice was smooth velvet stretched over broken glass. "You haven't been yourself since Evelyn passed. You keep forgetting things. You wander off without a word to anyone. The grief is taking a visible toll on your mind. We just want to protect you. There are so many predators out there who target vulnerable seniors with large, unguarded estates. We can't bear the thought of someone exploiting you when you're this fragile." The staggering hypocrisy of her words nearly shattered my composure entirely. They were the predators. They were the scammers right here in this vehicle. But I simply nodded slowly, eyes cast down at my visibly shaking hands. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly, playing the defeated victim to perfection. "It's very simple, Dad," Nate answered at once, his voice lifting with a wave of counterfeit relief. "We're heading to the lawyer's office right now to have you sign a comprehensive power of attorney document. It simply gives me the legal authority to manage all the complex financial matters, oversee the trusts, and handle the endless back and forth with the hospital billing departments. You won't have to trouble yourself with a single difficult thing ever again. You can rest at home and focus entirely on your health. We'll carry all of it for you." It was a brilliantly constructed, seamless lie. To any stranger looking in, they would appear to be the perfect devoted family, stepping up with grace and love to care for a frail, grieving patriarch. But I knew exactly what that document was. It was a blank check. The instant my signature touched that page, Nate would have unrestricted, unquestioned legal authority to liquidate every asset I had ever built. Iris reached down to the floorboard and produced a polished black insulated flask. She unscrewed the top, carefully releasing a thick curl of fragrant steam into the sealed, climate-controlled cabin. "Here, Harold," she murmured warmly, leaning over the center console to hand me a small insulated travel cup. "I made your special herbal tea before we left the house. It's the same soothing blend I used to brew for Evelyn whenever she felt completely overwhelmed and anxious. It'll help settle your nerves and clear away some of that confusion you've been struggling with. Drink it while it's still hot." I accepted the warm cup from her perfectly steady hand. My own fingers were trembling, and for once the shaking was not a performance. It was pure, undisguised revulsion. I looked down at the dark liquid swirling slowly inside the small cup. The rich scent of lavender and lemon balm failed to fully mask what was beneath it, something subtle, unsettlingly dense and faintly metallic, something that did not belong. "You should drink it, Dad." Nate pressed, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Iris spent all morning making that for you. It does wonders for cognitive stability. You know you need it right now." I raised the thin rim slowly to my lips, feigning a long, hesitant sip, but kept my mouth firmly shut the entire time. Then Nate swore sharply at a delivery truck cutting across the downtown intersection, his full attention yanked hard into the lurching traffic. In that split second of distraction, I gave my right wrist a sharp, deliberate jolt. A heavy splash of scalding liquid sloshed over the cup's edge and dropped squarely onto the synthetic floor mat beneath my shoes. I glanced down at the dark, steaming puddle. Almost immediately, a faint but unmistakable chemical hiss rose from the footwell. The resilient rubber of the mat began to visibly discolor, turning a sickly bleached yellow precisely where the liquid had landed. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the sternum, violent, undeniable, and absolute. My brilliant, fiercely perceptive wife had not died of natural causes, sudden and unavoidable. Her fatal heart attack had been preceded by 5 agonizing months of severe neurological deterioration, crippling joint pain, and a profound, debilitating mental fog. Symptoms that mirrored with chilling precision exactly what I had been living through for the past 5 consecutive months. Symptoms they had conveniently and repeatedly attributed to old age and the weight of my grief. I was not losing my mind. I was not dying of a broken heart. I was being deliberately, methodically, and systematically poisoned. The remainder of the car ride passed in a suffocating haze. I kept my breathing shallow, running complex structural calculations in my head to prevent my hands from reaching across the console and closing around my son's throat. They were killing me slowly, incrementally, just as they had killed Evelyn. Every swallow of that bitter tea, every carefully placed hand on my shoulder, each one a calculated step in my own execution. Nate guided the vehicle into a rundown commercial plaza on the edge of the financial district. I studied the squat, weathered brick building wedged between a failing dry cleaner and a discount liquor store. The faded gold lettering on the glass door read Aldcott and Associates Legal Counsel. This was nowhere near the gleaming downtown high-rise where my trusted estate attorney Clifford Egan operated. Clifford had managed my family trust for 3 decades, a shark in a tailored suit who interrogated every comma. Nate knew Clifford would never permit a transfer of power without a ruthless cross-examination. So my son had bypassed the family lawyer entirely and gone hunting for a bottom-feeding opportunist willing to work fast for a quick fee. I stumbled slightly, climbing out of the car, leaning hard against the doorframe. Iris materialized instantly at my side, gripping my elbow. We shuffled into a cramped reception area that smelled of stale coffee. A man in a poorly fitted gray suit waited behind a cluttered desk, offering a slick smile that stopped well short of his eyes. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer said, extending a clammy hand. "I am Spencer Aldcott. Nate has told me a great deal about you. We only have a few standard documents to execute today just to lift some of this heavy administrative burden from your shoulders." I nodded slowly, offering a trembling handshake. They steered me into a small conference room. Nate pulled out a chair and pressed both hands firmly onto my shoulders as I settled into it. Aldcott slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the scarred wooden table. "This is a durable power of attorney," Aldcott explained, tapping a cheap plastic pen against the signature line. "It grants your son immediate legal authority to consolidate your bank accounts, liquidate stock assets, and manage all outstanding medical and tax liabilities. Given your declining health, it ensures your substantial estate remains fully protected." I stared down at the dense legal language. It was a death warrant. The moment my name was on that page, Nate could wire my entire $40 million in savings to any offshore account he chose. He could drain everything I had built, leaving me destitute before the poison finished its work. I reached out with a trembling hand and let my fingers hover uncertainly over the pen. Nate leaned in close, his breath shallow with barely contained anticipation. "Just sign right there at the bottom, Dad," he urged, his voice soft and tight. "Right next to the blue sticker." I picked up the pen. The tip met the paper, and then I unleashed a violent, rattling cough. I doubled forward in the chair, hacking without control, pressing my forearm hard against my mouth. I let the pen slip from my fingers and clatter to the floor. Iris was quickly beside me with a paper napkin, her face arranged into a mask of practiced concern. I wheezed heavily, playing the role of a spent, fading old man with every ounce of discipline I had. "I'm so sorry," I rasped, rubbing my chest. "It's just so tight today." I squinted down at the documents, narrowing my eyes as though the text had gone soft and blurry. Nate, I can't make out a single word of this. I must have left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter at home. Aldcott frowned, shooting a nervous glance at my son. You don't strictly need to read the fine print, Mr. Vance. I've summarized all the key provisions for you. It's entirely standard boilerplate. I shook my head stubbornly, pushing the thick stack away with a clumsy sweep of my hand. No, I mumbled, blurring my words just slightly. Evelyn always told me never to sign anything I hadn't read with my own two eyes. I'll take these home. I'll look them over during the long weekend when my head is clearer. We can come back next week. The silence that fell over the room was dense enough to press against your skin. I looked up, letting my vacant gaze drift toward my son. Nate was staring straight at me, and for one terrifying fraction of a second, his carefully maintained mask collapsed entirely. The veins in his neck stood out, his jaw clamped down with such raw, barely contained fury that I could almost hear his teeth grinding. He looked at me the way a trapped predator eyes the thing fouling its hunt. He wanted to seize my hand and drag the pen across that page himself. Dad, Nate began, his voice low and pulled taut as wire. We really need to get this wrapped up today. The tax deadlines are closing in fast. Before he could snap at me, Iris stepped smoothly in front of him, planting a firm, restraining hand against his chest. She turned to me with that patient, hollow smile. Of course, Harold, Iris cooed, gently gathering the papers and sliding them into a manila folder. Take all the time you need. There is absolutely no rush. We want you to feel completely at ease with everything. Nate is just a little wound up about the hospital bills. That's all. Nate swallowed his rage and forced out a stiff wooden nod. Yeah, right. Sorry, Dad. Take the weekend. We'll go through it all together on Monday. They drove me home in near total silence. The hostility radiating from the front seats was thick and unmistakable. I clutched the manila folder tightly against my chest like a shield against their quiet, lethal desperation. Every mile confirmed what I already knew. The clock was running. They needed this money now, and my refusal to sign had just sharply accelerated their timeline. When we finally turned into my long, sweeping driveway, Iris unclipped her seatbelt and turned to face me with a composed, unsettling smile. Harold, I'm going to stay the night in the guest room, she announced, her voice perfectly smooth. You had such a terrible coughing spell back at that office, and you seem so fragile today. I want to cook you a proper dinner and make sure you're looked after tonight. I'd never forgive myself if something happened while you were here alone. My stomach clenched. She was not here out of care. She was here to watch me, to make certain I received my daily measure of whatever slow-acting poison she had been feeding me. That's very kind of you, Iris, I whispered faintly, letting her help me out of the car. Later that evening, after a quiet, closely supervised dinner, I withdrew to my private study. I settled into the large leather armchair and stared at the dark mahogany desk. Iris knocked softly and came in carrying a small silver tray. On it sat a steaming mug of her special herbal tea and a small, unmarked white pill. Nate spoke to your doctor this afternoon, Harold, she lied effortlessly, handing me the pill. He prescribed a new concentrated vitamin supplement to support your heart and clear up that brain fog. You need to take it now and drink every drop of your tea so you can get a proper night's sleep. I looked at the pill sitting in my palm. Perfectly smooth, no pharmaceutical markings whatsoever, a silent, untraceable instrument. I gave her a weak, grateful nod and raised my hand to my mouth. I tossed the pill back, but guided it deftly under my tongue. I lifted a glass of water from the desk and took a long, convincing swallow. There, I said, producing a tired, raspy exhale. All gone. Iris smiled, her eyes tracking the mug of steaming tea. Drink up, she urged softly. I'll be just outside in the hallway if you need anything at all. She turned and walked slowly out of the study, drawing the heavy wooden door most of the way shut, leaving a narrow crack so she could listen. The moment her footsteps softened down the hall, I moved with swift, silent precision. I spat the half-dissolved bitter pill into a thick paper napkin and pushed it deep into my trouser pocket. I took hold of the hot mug of toxic tea and crossed quietly over the thick Persian rug toward the door. Just outside the study, standing in the long, shadowed corridor, was a large, decorative potted peace lily. I leaned carefully through the narrow gap in the doorway, making certain Iris was completely out of sight in the distant kitchen. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tipped the entire contents of the steaming mug into the deep soil of the large, decorative potted peace lily. The dark liquid disappeared into the earth without a trace. I wiped the rim of the ceramic mug, made my way back to the desk, and sat down in the silence, fully prepared now to wage a devastating war. I opened my eyes to pale morning light seeping through the heavy bedroom curtains. For the first time in 5 agonizing months, the room did not pitch and spin the moment I lifted my head from the pillow. I lay still on the mattress, drawing a slow, measured breath, running a silent inventory of every joint and muscle in my aging body. The grinding ache in my knees, the leaden stiffness across my shoulders, the suffocating mental fog that had smothered my thoughts for months, all of it was noticeably receding. Not a complete recovery, but the absence of that oppressive physical weight was undeniable. A single missed dose of Iris's special homemade herbal tea had been enough to hand my body a moment of genuine, desperate clarity. I pushed myself upright on the edge of the mattress, planting both feet flat on the hardwood floor. My legs did not shake. My hands held out before me were perfectly steady. The full cold truth of my situation settled over me again, sharp and merciless. Every symptom I had been suffering, the weakness, the confusion, the sudden inability to recall the simplest things, had been a meticulously engineered illusion. They were deliberately dismantling my physical structure, eroding my health one day at a time. Microgram by microgram engineering an inevitable collapse that would read to the world as the natural, tragic decline of a heartbroken old man. They had done the exact same thing to Evelyn. They had watched her fade, offering false smiles and poisoned cups of tea until her heart gave out entirely. I rose to my feet, my spine straightening with a cold, renewed sense of dangerous purpose. I dressed quietly, plain slacks, a comfortable sweater, keeping up the visual pretense of a vulnerable, beaten man. I opened the bedroom door and moved out into the long, hushed hallway toward the main living area. The house was still apart from the faint murmur of voices floating up from the kitchen below. As I moved down the corridor, I stopped just outside my private study. My gaze settled on the large, decorative potted peace lily in the corner. Only the night before, it had been a vigorous, healthy plant, its leaves reaching upward in the morning light. Now it was a grim monument to my son's treachery. The plant was completely dead. Every leaf had withered to a dry, brittle husk. The stems were blackened, curled inward as if scorched by some invisible chemical heat. The dark soil at the base of the ceramic pot was stained a sickly, unnatural yellow, precisely where I had emptied Iris's mug. The concentrated toxicity required to destroy a healthy, mature plant within a matter of hours was staggering to comprehend. Had I swallowed that pill and drunk that tea, I might not have opened my eyes this morning. I might have become another tragic, sudden heart attack. Another convenient loss for Nate and Iris to mourn tearfully at an expensive, catered funeral. I stood staring at those blackened, curled leaves and felt a cold, hollow void expand where my love for my son used to live. The boy I had steadied on a bicycle, the young man I had watched cross a graduation stage, he no longer existed. Something else entirely had taken his place, a ruthless, calculating predator, and I intended to treat him precisely as such. I continued down the wide staircase, gripping the banister and deliberately dragging my steps into the heavy shuffle of a depleted old man. I stepped into the bright, sunlit kitchen. Nate was parked at the marble island, hammering away at his laptop, dressed in a sharp navy suit. His leather briefcase sat on the counter beside him. Iris stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal with easy, cheerful strokes, humming softly to herself as though she had not spent the previous evening quietly attempting to poison her father-in-law. "Good morning, Harold," Iris chirped, spinning around with a wide, polished smile. "Did you sleep well? The house was so quiet all night. You must have been completely worn out." I gave her a slow, hollow nod. "I slept very deeply, Iris," I murmured, keeping my voice low and faint. "That herbal tea you made me worked absolute wonders. I feel like I barely moved a muscle all night long." Iris and Nate exchanged a quick, deeply satisfied look. Nate glanced up from his screen, offering a flat, perfunctory smile. "Good to hear it, Dad. You need to be resting and building your strength. We still have to get back to the lawyer's office on Monday and get those documents signed off. These delays are becoming genuinely frustrating." Before I could cobble together a suitably feeble response, Nate's phone erupted against the marble countertop. He looked down at the glowing screen and something shifted in him immediately. The confidence drained from his posture in an instant. His face went pale, raw panic flooding his eyes. He grabbed the phone as if it might bite him. "I need to take this," Nate said, his voice tight and strained. He shoved his chair back hard and moved at near sprint toward the glass patio doors. Iris turned back to the stove. He stepped outside and yanked the heavy glass door shut behind him, pacing furiously along the wooden deck with the phone pressed hard to his ear. Iris frowned at the disruption and redirected her attention to the bubbling oatmeal. "Oh, for goodness sake, we're completely out of almond milk. Do you want some, Harold?" She sighed with theatrical frustration. "Let me run down to the basement pantry and grab a fresh carton. I'll be right back. Please don't touch the hot stove." She pressed a towel to her hands and headed briskly toward the basement stairs. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me entirely alone in the spacious kitchen. I looked through the glass. Nate was pacing furiously near the edge of the swimming pool, dragging a hand through his immaculately groomed hair, his expression locked in frantic, desperate conversation. He was completely consumed. Whatever crisis was playing out on the other end of that call had swallowed him whole. I turned my attention back to the kitchen counter. Nate's combination-locked leather briefcase was sitting there completely unguarded. My entire engineering career had required me to understand the mechanical vulnerabilities of physical security systems of all kinds. A standard 3-digit combination lock on a consumer-grade briefcase was elementary, a simple mechanism dependent on internal tension pins. I shed the frail old man in an instant and moved with swift, silent precision. I stepped to the counter and reached into my pocket for the small metal paperclip I had always kept on me. I straightened the wire into a rigid tension tool. I worked the tip into the narrow gap beside the first numbered dial, applying firm, even pressure against the internal latch. I rotated the dial slowly with my thumb, feeling for the minute mechanical click that meant the pin had found its groove. Click. I moved to the second dial and ran the same deliberate process. Click. The third dial turned smoothly and dropped into place with a final satisfying snap. I pressed the brass release buttons and the leather flap swung open. I didn't waste a second. I moved past the glossy marketing brochures, the thick financial portfolios, the expensive pens, and dug straight into the rear compartment. My fingers met a heavy stack of quality legal paper bound beneath a stark blue cover. I drew it out and scanned the bold capitalized text on the front page. It was a heavily modified, legally notarized copy of Evelyn Vance's irrevocable trust agreement. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was the master document, the absolute financial core of my entire $40 million estate. Clifford Egan, my actual attorney, held the original copies locked away in his firm's vault. Nate had clearly retained this cut-rate downtown lawyer to draft a string of aggressive, flatly illegal amendments to the trust structure designed to circumvent every legal protection I had built over decades. My fingers moved fast through those thick, weighty pages, the same trained precision I'd once used to parse load-bearing specifications now hunting through clauses and subsections. I blew past the boilerplate inheritance language and the property schedules, zeroing in on whatever had been freshly inserted. It was buried near the rear of the document, a brand new, heavily highlighted section with no legitimate reason to exist, clearly labeled Section 4B, Contingency of Spousal Survivorship. I traced the words with one finger. What moved through me wasn't shock, it was something colder, pure Arctic recognition. The legal phrasing had been engineered with surgical precision to dissolve every safeguard protecting my estate. I bent closer to that final sentence, the one that made everything crystalline. The ink on that white page told me exactly what my son had done. All the elaborate legal vocabulary amounted to one brutal thing, a survivorship trap bent entirely toward greed. The terms of our trust were plain. I held authority over the $40 million estate with the bulk earmarked for medical charities upon my death. Nate had hollowed that out completely. Under Section 4B, if I died within 6 months of Evelyn, every charitable bequest would be wiped out. The full $40 million estate would flow 100% directly to Nate. A power of attorney was too fragile, too easily contested in court. What Nate wanted was ironclad, unchallengeable title. For that, I simply had to stop breathing. I pressed both palms flat against the cold granite of the kitchen island and steadied myself. My gaze drifted past the appliances to the digital calendar mounted on the wall oven panel. The same mind that had spent decades calculating load tolerances now ran a far grimmer equation. Evelyn had been gone 5 months and 2 weeks. The 6-month mark, the anniversary of her murder, sat exactly 14 days out. Something cold and absolute settled over me, burning away the last embers of a father's wishful thinking. This was never about bleeding my accounts dry over time. This was a scheduled killing. Nate and Iris were running against a hard deadline, and they both knew it. Every bitter cup of herbal tea, every unmarked pill pressed into my palm had been calibrated to push my body toward catastrophic organ failure before those 2 weeks ran out. They needed my heart to give out before the middle of April. One day past that 6-month threshold, and the charitable provisions in the trust would cement permanently cutting Nate off from the $40 million windfall he needed to dig himself out of his illegal offshore debts. So they were timing it, waiting patiently for the accumulated thallium to reach critical mass in my blood, counting the hours until I crumpled to the floor the way his mother had. I drew one long, slow breath and packed my rage somewhere deep and airless behind a wall nothing could crack. 14 days to reverse the trap they'd set. 14 days to take apart everything my son had built on top of my wife's grave. Then the patio glass shuddered hard in its track. Boot heels hit the deck boards with sharp, aggressive purpose. Nate's call had cut short and his shape was closing on the kitchen fast. My pulse went loud and rapid against my sternum. I had under 2 seconds. I drove the legal document back into the hidden rear compartment of the briefcase. The marketing brochures went back over the top, same careless disorder Nate had left them in. One firm push on the leather flap. The brass latches bit shut with a sharp crack of sound right as the glass door wrenched open. Nate came through into the kitchen, color high in his face, the knot of his expensive tie hanging loose at his collar. He practically launched his phone at the dining table. Every line of his body hummed with a wired, barely leashed agitation. His eyes cut straight to the kitchen island. He pulled up short. I was too near the briefcase, my hands suspended just above those brass locks. The room changed in an instant. The atmosphere went dense, almost pressurized. Nate rolled his shoulders forward and took one slow, deliberate step toward me. Whatever pretense of filial concern he'd been wearing fell away entirely, and what replaced it was the flat, watchful stare of something protecting what it owns. "What are you doing?" His tone had no warmth in it whatsoever, low level, the kind of quiet that precedes something. "Why are you standing over my bag?" I didn't give him movement. I didn't retreat a single step. 40 years of boardrooms and hostile contractors had taught me how to hold a room. I let my frame soften and sag. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple, drawing slow circles as if a fog had rolled in behind my eyes. "Just hunting for the sugar bowl, Nate," I said, letting my voice go slack and faintly slurred. "Thought I might sweeten up my tea a little. Your wife brewed me a cup, but it's turned out terribly bitter this morning. I can't seem to locate where Evelyn used to keep the sugar. Things just don't stay where I expect them in this kitchen anymore." Nate held his gaze on me like a laser, cataloging every crease and expression, looking for the tell. He studied each feature on my face as though a fracture might appear if he stared long enough. His eyes dropped to the briefcase. They rose again to my shaking hands. I gave him a feeble, slightly dazed smile, blinking slowly like the overhead lights were too harsh for me. The coiled tension went out of him 1 degree at a time. The performance had landed. He saw exactly what he expected, a hollowed-out old man mind crumbling under the weight of loss and years. "Sugar lives in the pantry, Dad," Nate said, his voice sliding back into that cloying, over-patient register. "Same place it's always been. Go rest yourself in the living room. You look like you're running on empty. I'll send Iris out with it." I gave a faint nod and dragged my feet across the tile, every step deliberate and slow, the portrait of a man with nothing left in him. Head low, playing the broken patriarch all the way to the hall. At the kitchen's edge, the basement door opened. Iris came back in with a fresh carton of almond milk, and one glance at Nate told her the air hadn't fully cleared. "Everything all right?" she asked, voice gentle. I stopped just past the archway, invisible to them, near enough that their low voices reached me clean. "He was drifting around the island hunting for sugar." Nate muttered, a long, exhausted breath escaping him. "The man's mind is gone, Iris. Half the time he has no idea what room he's standing in. But we're out of runway. That call from my boss, it was bad. They want what they're owed before the month ends, or they come collect personally. We can't just sit here and let nature take its time." There was a quiet shift of fabric as Iris moved toward him. "I know," she murmured, her voice scraped clean of anything resembling feeling. "It's working, but he's always had more endurance than he should. Tonight at dinner we double it. Bring the daily amount up sharply. This whole ugly business wraps up by the weekend." I stood in that dark hallway with my spine against the plaster and didn't breathe. In the kitchen, Nate and Iris went on talking in low, poisonous tones, with no idea that every word of their timetable had just been laid bare to me. I waited. Nate's shoes crossed toward the front of the house, Iris's heels behind him. Coats, the thud of the oak door, the automatic deadbolt snapping home. Silence. The particular total silence of a house that was mine long before either of them existed. I came out of the shadows and went straight to my study. The crumpled paper napkin came out of my pocket. The dissolved pill inside had dried to a pale, chalky smear. Then I went to the ravaged potted peace lily. I pushed into the darkened, wilted leaves, broke away a few dead stems, and dug out a small fistful of the sickened soil. Everything went into a sealed plastic bag with the napkin. My hands didn't waver. The trembling act was finished. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was an engineer staring at a catastrophic failure, ready to find the break point, keys in hand, out the door. I took my modest sedan right past the rows of downtown hospitals. I needed people who asked nothing and recorded nothing. A structural engineer learns one thing above everything else: find the precise moment a solid structure gives way and you own the failure completely. And now I was applying that same clinical methodology to my own blood. I steered toward a sleek, unmarked glass building tucked into the affluent northern suburbs, a high-end private analytical laboratory that served elite corporate clients running independent chemical testing for industrial litigation. I walked into the immaculate lobby and approached the front desk. No name, no medical history, I set the sealed bag on the white counter and asked for an immediate toxicological screening. The receptionist cited standard processing windows of 3 to 5 business days. I opened my checkbook and wrote a figure exactly 4 times their normal expedited rate. I told her I needed a granular molecular breakdown of every compound present in both the pill residue and the soil before sunset. Money dissolves bureaucratic obstacles. She summoned a senior chemist who collected the samples with a grave nod. I spent 3 agonizing hours in that silent waiting room running the precise geometry of my son's deception through my mind on a continuous loop. At last, the reinforced glass door to the inner laboratory opened with a click. A senior analytical chemist, late 50s, exhaustion carved into his face, white coat, crisp, gestured quietly for me to follow him into his office. He shut the door and held still until the electronic lock engaged with a firm snap. He dropped into his chair and pushed a thick, freshly printed diagnostic report across the glass desktop. The pages were dense with chemical spectrum graphs and bright warning markers flagging extreme toxicity levels. "You asked for a complete molecular breakdown," the chemist said, his voice pulled tight with professional unease. "The white residue in the napkin is a highly concentrated, unregulated synthetic sedative. It's a powerful central nervous system depressant engineered to produce extreme lethargy, severe cognitive confusion, and deep physical weakness. In elderly patients, the presentation is essentially indistinguishable from advanced dementia or accelerated neurological decline." I held my jaw rigid and asked about the soil sample, my voice frighteningly even. The chemist drew a slow breath and looked at me with an expression somewhere between deep pity and outright alarm. "The soil is thoroughly saturated with a heavy metal compound, thallium," he said grimly. "Tasteless, odorless, lethal even at microscopic concentrations. It has a long reputation in criminal history as the poisoner's poison precisely because a standard blood panel won't catch it without a specific targeted screen. It goes to work on the central nervous system and the cardiovascular muscles. Given sufficient time, a slow accumulation causes severe joint pain, profound cognitive deterioration, and eventually a sudden catastrophic cardiac arrest. A standard hospital autopsy finds almost nothing. The victim simply looks like they died of a heart attack." The sterile walls of that office seemed to press inward as the full weight of what I was hearing settled into my bones. Every piece locked into place. Each grinding symptom I'd endured across the past 5 months, the bone-deep exhaustion, the terrifying gaps in memory, the mornings I couldn't navigate my own staircase, all of it had been manufactured. Nate and Iris had been running a parallel operation, daily sedatives, to mask the cognitive damage while the thallium worked silently through my cardiovascular system. Then the darkest realization of my life arrived. Evelyn, my beautiful, vibrant, deeply loved wife, had not been taken by some sudden, unavoidable medical event. She had felt that same devastating joint pain. She had lived inside that same frightening mental fog. They had poisoned her, methodically watching her decline with warm smiles, bringing her cup after cup of toxic tea until her heart finally buckled beneath the accumulated strain. They killed the woman who was the center of my entire existence, solely to trip the financial contingencies buried inside a legal trust. And now, racing against a hard 2-week deadline, they were preparing to sharply double my dose and close the account. The chemist leaned forward, cutting through the silence. "Sir," he said, urgency sharpening every word, "this constitutes severe criminal poisoning. I am legally required to advise you to contact the authorities immediately. This report needs to go directly to law enforcement." I looked down at those chemical graphs. Something cold and bottomless opened inside me. If I dialed the police that moment, Nate and Iris would be taken from their comfortable home in handcuffs. They'd have expensive defense attorneys retained within hours, every appeal exhausted across years of proceedings while they sat in a climate-controlled cell eating regular meals and sleeping on a schedule. That was nowhere near enough. An arrest was far too orderly, far too forgiving for people who had tortured and killed my wife. I raised my eyes to the visibly shaken chemist, and what he saw in mine was a man from whom all warmth, all paternal feeling, all mercy had been fully vacated. "No," I said quietly, folding the toxicology report and sliding it into my inner jacket pocket. "The police won't be needed. I have no interest in watching my son go quietly to a cell. I intend to dismantle his entire existence methodically, completely, and permanently." I stepped out of the laboratory into the fading afternoon. The report sat against my chest like a loaded weapon tucked inside my coat. The grief had finished burning. What remained was cold structural resolve. I drove to a secure public payphone outside a weathered bus depot on the city's outskirts, no digital trail, no record of the call. I dialed a private, unlisted number I'd carried in memory for 3 decades. 2 rings. Then a gruff, familiar voice answered with measured wariness. Clifford Egan was not simply my estate attorney. He was a legal predator of genuine ferocity, a man who had built his entire reputation by systematically destroying anyone foolish enough to defraud his clients. I told him I needed an immediate meeting completely off the record, well away from his downtown offices. I told him my own son was in the process of killing me. Clifford asked no clarifying questions. He gave me an address, a private secured warehouse on the industrial side of the river, and told me to come today. I pulled up to the sprawling corrugated metal structure as the first heavy autumn rain began to fall. Inside, Clifford had set up a stark, harshly lit office of reinforced glass and steel within the vast, empty shell of the building. He stood there in a tailored black suit, those sharp, predatory eyes cataloging my disheveled state the moment I came through the door. I dispensed with pleasantries entirely. I sat at the cold steel table and laid the expedited toxicology report directly in front of him. Beside it, I placed the high-resolution photographs I had taken earlier, the forged power of attorney documents Nate had tried to have me sign at that backstreet law office. Clifford put on his reading glasses and opened the laboratory file. I watched his jaw harden as his eyes moved through the chemical breakdown, the sedatives, the lethal thallium concentrations, all of it laid out in clinical detail. Then he turned to the photographs and studied the fraudulent trust amendments with equal precision, noting the fabricated contingency clause designed to nullify the charitable bequests and funnel the full estate to Nate. He shut the file with a single sharp snap. His face was cold professional fury, nothing more. He had managed Evelyn's legal affairs for 30 years. He thought of us as close personal friends. The comprehension that my son had poisoned her for financial gain lit something quietly terrifying inside the man. "We are not taking this to the police," Clifford said, his voice stripped of all warmth. "If this evidence reaches the authorities right now, your son retains an aggressive defense team within the hour. They will argue loudly that you are suffering from severe dementia, and they have 5 months of documented behavior to support that claim. They will challenge the laboratory results as circumstantial or suggest you inadvertently poisoned yourself during a period of mental decline. Nate will ride this through the criminal courts for a decade on bail without losing a night's sleep." I nodded. His assessment was ruthless and entirely correct. I told Clifford what I wanted: a complete and methodical demolition of Nate's world, his fabricated reputation, his stolen money, his freedom, until there was nothing left standing. Clifford pulled an encrypted laptop from his leather briefcase and began typing with the focused intensity of a man who had been waiting his whole career for exactly this. He told me his elite forensic accounting team was coming online immediately. If Nate was taking risks this catastrophic to illegally seize $40 million inside a rigid 2-week window, there had to be a massive hemorrhaging wound somewhere in his personal finances, and they were going to find it. I sat in that sterile warehouse office for 4 grueling hours, listening to the relentless percussion of Clifford's keyboard and his clipped, intense exchanges with his financial investigators. His team had unrestricted backdoor access to global banking networks, hidden offshore registries, and heavily encrypted financial databases that night. They were hunters in the digital dark, tracking the invisible and convoluted movement of capital across international borders. I watched cold rain punish the high warehouse windows, my mind fixed entirely on the coming dismantling of the man I once raised with pride. Nate had always worn the image of a flawlessly successful investment banker like a second skin. Custom suits, gleaming imported vehicles, casual boasts about unbeatable portfolios delivered without a flicker of hesitation. But as the clock crawled past midnight, Clifford finally pushed his laptop back from the table's edge. He pulled off his reading glasses and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose with a long, weighted exhale. What he had uncovered was not merely shocking, it was contemptible. "Your son is a complete fraud, Harold," Clifford said quietly, rotating the laptop so the cascading columns of red figures faced me. "The high-flying investment banker persona is a hollow shell engineered from scratch to deceive everyone in his orbit. There is no thriving stock portfolio. He doesn't even hold clear title to that sprawling estate where he and Iris are living. The property is mortgaged to its absolute limit, and he has quietly taken out 4 separate illegal secondary loans against it using fabricated corporate income statements." I stared at the wreckage scrolling across that glowing screen. Clifford tapped a specific folder on the dashboard, and a series of complex, heavily encrypted transaction logs unfurled 3 years of financial devastation laid out in granular detail. "Nate is a severe gambling addict," Clifford continued, his voice heavy with unfiltered contempt. "Over the past 3 years, he has fully liquidated his legitimate savings to bankroll massive volatile cryptocurrency speculation and illegal offshore sports betting operations. When the crypto markets collapsed and his aggressive positions failed, he started borrowing on high margin to cover the losses as they piled up. According to the forensic audit, Nate was currently submerged under exactly $15 million in unsecured illegal offshore gambling debt. I let that number settle through me in silence. $15 million. Clifford leaned over the steel table, his expression darkening further. It goes considerably worse than that, Harold, the veteran attorney said, drawing up a highly classified file. His expert team had just successfully intercepted from a secure dark web communication server. The money Nate had borrowed illegally came directly from a violent, deeply ruthless underground criminal syndicate. Intercepted communications confirmed they were actively threatening to kill him. I was murdering his parents to steal $40 million purely to buy his own survival. That revelation hung in the cold industrial air of the warehouse like something with physical mass. $15 million owed to men who did not send polite notices or discuss payment arrangements. My son was not simply a greedy opportunist reaching early for an inheritance. He was a cornered animal drowning inside a violent criminal underworld prepared to slaughter his own family to surface for air. I looked across the steel table at Clifford. His face had the texture of carved stone. He closed the classified financial file on his encrypted laptop, steepled his fingers, and sat in complete silence waiting for my instruction. I told him we were not going to sit back and let Nate attempt another crude legal maneuver or produce another forged document. We were going to give my son precisely what he was desperate for, but we were going to thread it with invisible federal razor wire. Clifford's mouth curved into a sharp, cold smile, and he dragged the laptop back open, fingers moving across the keys with renewed purpose. The next 3 hours were spent constructing the snare. Clifford called it a digital honeypot. Working through his high-level banking contacts, he carved exactly $5 million from my primary estate holdings and transferred it into a newly formed, tightly restricted subsidiary account. The account was rigged throughout with complex digital tripwires. Then we drafted a narrow, precisely worded partial power of attorney. Nothing like the sweeping blank check document Nate had tried to press on me at that backstreet law firm. This one gave my son temporary legal authority to manage trade and execute transactions within this single $5 million account and nothing beyond it. I asked Clifford how this would destroy him. He walked through the mechanics with the precision of a man who had done this before. By granting Nate access to the account under the guise of legitimate domestic investment management, we were extending a formal invitation for him to step across an enormous, uncrossable legal threshold. The moment he attempted to wire those funds to an unverified offshore entity to settle his illegal gambling debts, the act would constitute textbook, irrefutable federal wire fraud. Beyond that, because the account carried digital tags placed by Clifford's forensic team, the attorney was quietly looping in his highest contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Cyber Division would be watching every routing address the instant any international wire transfer was initiated. The trap carried a mandatory lengthy federal prison sentence, bypassing local jurisdiction entirely and foreclosing any possibility of bail hearings or expensive appeals. I left the warehouse just as a bleak dawn began pulling color into the city's skyline, bruised purples and charcoals bleeding across the horizon. I drove back to the quiet house I had built, mentally steeling myself for the most demanding performance of my life. When I came through the front door, Iris was already in the kitchen, cheerfully brewing another fresh pot of her lethal aromatic tea. I let my shoulders drop forward, immediately dragged my feet across the hardwood, and manufactured a deliberate rattling wheeze that carried through the quiet foyer. She came toward me quickly, her face a polished mask of practiced concern, gently scolding me for leaving the house alone in my fragile state. I told her I had simply driven to the pharmacy to collect the new vitamins she'd asked for, playing the confused, compliant victim without a crack in the performance. I accepted the steaming mug she placed in my hands, carried it slowly into my private study, and poured the toxic liquid straight into the waste bin, covering the sound of it with a loud, jagged coughing fit. That afternoon, I called Nate. I told him my chest had grown terribly tight, my mind was slipping faster than before, and I needed him at the house right away. I told him I wanted to make things right between us. He arrived in under 20 minutes, the tires of his gleaming dark gray luxury sedan biting hard into the long driveway as he pulled in. He came through the door practically at a run, his eyes sweeping the hallway with barely suppressed frantic urgency. He needed that capital desperately. The criminal syndicate's deadline was likely right at his throat. I was in my large leather armchair at the center of the study, buried in a heavy wool blanket and trembling deliberately. I raised one weak hand and gestured for him to take the chair across from my mahogany desk. "Nate," I whispered, letting my voice fracture with manufactured grief. "I am so exhausted. I can't keep fighting these administrative burdens anymore. You were right. I am losing my hold on things, and I am frightened of destroying the legacy I built alongside your mother." Nate leaned forward in his seat, both hands clamped on his knees, wrestling to hold his predatory hunger behind a facade of filial concern. "It's going to be all right, Dad," he murmured, his voice smooth and false. "I'm here for you now. I'll carry all of this from here. You just need to put your name on the paperwork from yesterday and then you can rest." I shook my head slowly and let a single rehearsed tear track down my face. I told him my fragile heart could not bear the strain of surrendering the entire $40 million estate in one motion. It felt too much like signing away what remained of my life. Instead, I drew the manila folder Clifford had prepared from beneath my wool blanket and slid it carefully across the desk. I told him I had spoken with a junior clerk at the bank early that morning and had isolated $5 million into a separate dedicated trading account. What was about to come out of that investigation? The real reason behind everything my son had done was something I was not fully prepared for. It would reframe every moment I thought I understood. Before we get there, tell me this: if you suspected someone close to you was hiding a catastrophic secret, would you confront them head-on or watch and wait in silence? I wanted him to take charge of this specific account first, manage some aggressive investments on my behalf just to settle my nerves. I told him that if he handled this initial portfolio well, we could talk about moving the rest of the family trust over next month. Nate looked down at the crisp document sitting on the desk. $5 million. I could almost see the frantic arithmetic grinding behind his eyes. It wasn't the full $40 million he needed to steal, but it was an enormous immediate injection of liquid capital, enough to buy him breathing room to temporarily quiet the violent men closing in on him to keep himself alive while he worked out how to finish poisoning me and take the rest of the estate. Greed and raw desperation fought a visible war across his face. He lifted the legal document, eyes moving quickly across the narrow specific clauses. Clifford had drafted it with surgical precision. To a desperate drowning man, it looked exactly like a legitimate, incredibly lucky windfall from a senile father. Nate reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced his heavy silver fountain pen. There was no hesitation. He signed his name on the dotted line with a rapid, practiced flourish, and in doing so lashed his own wrists to the federal honeypot. I exhaled a long, heavy breath and let my head fall back against the leather chair, telling him the account was fully active and the digital routing access codes were printed on the second page. I mentioned casually that it would ease my mind if he could execute a quick trade today just to get things moving. Nate gave me a sharp, victorious smile with no idea he was grinning at his own annihilation. He opened his laptop right there at my desk, fingers moving across the keyboard with urgent speed. He pulled up the banking portal, and within exactly 3 minutes he initiated a massive untraceable offshore wire transfer for the entire $5 million. He hit execute. The soft digital chime of the completed transaction settled into the quiet study. Nate shut the laptop and let out a long, shaky breath loaded with relief. He got to his feet, squeezed my shoulder, told me to get some rest, and assured me that everything would be just fine now. He walked out of the room with his head high, leaving me alone in the shadows. The instant the heavy wooden door clicked shut, my secure cell phone pulsed against my chest. I drew it out. An encrypted message from Clifford. The wire transfer had been intercepted. The federal tripwire had fired. The FBI's cyber division had logged Nate's exact IP address and captured the illicit offshore routing numbers tied directly to the violent underground syndicate. Nate had just handed federal investigators a smoking gun and gift-wrapped it for them. I was locked inside an ironclad trap of his own building. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold and dark satisfaction settling deep into my bones. My son was going to lose his freedom, his carefully polished reputation, and everything ahead of him. But just as I moved to pocket the phone, a second urgent alert flared across the encrypted screen. It was not from my attorney. It was a heavily encrypted message from Eli, the young, frightened audio technician I had left working in the back room of that small repair shop. I opened it. The text was short, but it turned the blood to ice inside me. "Get to the shop now," Eli had written, his terror bleeding through every word. "I've finished decrypting the remaining hidden segments of the audio file from your wife's glasses. It is infinitely worse than we thought." Eli's message burned in my skull. I did not spend a single moment savoring the trap that had just snapped shut on my son. I grabbed my keys, slipped out the side door into the afternoon rain, and got into my sedan. The drive across town dissolved into a blur of traffic lights and wet asphalt. I held the wheel with a grip so tight my knuckles went white. I moved through familiar streets toward the commercial district, my stomach winding into knots. What could possibly be worse than knowing your own child poisoned the woman you loved? I swung into the cracked parking lot of the electronics repair shop, tires cutting through standing water. The neon open sign in the front window had already gone dark. I pushed through the downpour and pulled the heavy glass door open. Eli was standing behind the cluttered service counter, pale and visibly sick. The moment I came through the door, the young technician moved quickly through the deadbolt and dragged the metal security blinds shut. The cramped shop dropped into deep shadow, lit only by the harsh blue glow of a single computer monitor on the main workbench. "You need to sit down for this, Mr. Vance," Eli whispered, his voice unsteady in the silence. He drew up an office chair and guided me into it. "I spent 12 hours running complex decryption algorithms on the damaged memory blocks inside your wife's smart glasses. I assumed it was a corrupted audio file, a glitch in the background software. But the impact of her fall did more than damage the microphone. It triggered a hidden video cache buried in the device firmware. The glasses were writing visual data directly to a partition in the moments before the central processor shattered against the floor. I reconstructed the final 3 minutes of visual and audio data. I sat rigid in the chair, the air locked in my chest. Evelyn had bought those smart glasses to help her read fine print and capture recipe videos without her hands. It had never crossed my mind that they would end up as the only witness to her own murder. "Play it," I said, and my voice had none of the frail old man left in it. Eli paused, his hand hovering above the mouse. He looked at me with deep, quiet pity, and then he clicked. The large monitor blazed to life. The image came in distorted, at first jagged interference lines cutting across the frame before resolving into terrible, breathtaking clarity. I was looking out through my wife's own eyes. The perspective shifted naturally as she moved through our brightly lit kitchen. I could hear her soft, familiar humming. A gentle melody she had carried for decades, a sound so warm and known that it cracked something open in my chest beyond repair. She was at the marble island, calmly pouring herself a glass of water. Then the camera jolted hard. A sharp, agonized gasp tore through the restored audio feed. Evelyn dropped the glass. I watched it explode across the polished hardwood floor in a shower of pieces. Her breathing turned shallow, rapid, and labored. The camera angle lurched downward as she collapsed heavily onto the kitchen tiles. Her hands filled the frame, clutching desperately at her chest. She was experiencing the massive, chemically induced heart attack the laboratory chemist had described. The accumulated thallium had finally pushed her cardiovascular system past the breaking point. The visual feed shook violently as Evelyn tried to drag herself across the cold floor, reaching weakly toward the lower kitchen cabinets. Her voice, barely there, soaked in terror, carried through the small shop's speakers. "Nate," she gasped, the words blurring and slurring together. "Iris, please help me." A pair of stylish designer heels stepped into the frame without urgency. The camera tilted slowly upward. Iris was standing directly above my dying wife. She wore a pristine white blouse and held a fresh cup of steaming coffee at her side. Her face was completely composed, no alarm, no grief, no trace of human feeling. Just a rigid, cold mask of total indifference. "Iris," Evelyn wheezed, one trembling hand reaching upward into the frame. "My pills on the counter, please. It's my heart. I cannot breathe." Iris crouched down at a measured pace and set her ceramic coffee mug neatly on the granite counter. She reached over and picked up the bright orange prescription bottle holding Evelyn's emergency nitroglycerin pills. The camera caught it perfectly, the clear plastic bottle sitting in Iris's manicured hand. My wife let out a soft, desperate sound of relief, believing in her final moments that help had arrived. Instead, Iris held dead empty eye contact with Evelyn, unscrewed the childproof cap with a smooth, practiced motion, and walked without haste to the stainless steel kitchen sink. The restored audio captured it, exactly the distinct, horrible sound of dozens of life-saving pills rattling down the metal drain, followed immediately by the rush of running water washing them away forever. Evelyn let out a choked, devastated sob. The camera angle dropped flat against the floor as whatever physical strength she had left simply gave out. She lay there utterly helpless, watching her own daughter-in-law calmly withhold the one thing that might have kept her alive. Then a second set of heavy footsteps entered the kitchen with unhurried confidence, breaking the stillness. Nate walked slowly into the absolute center of the digital frame. He had on expensive running shoes and was looking down at his struggling mother with the detached, clinical curiosity of someone observing an insect pinned to hot pavement. He crouched beside Iris, leaning in very close. His face filled the entire screen. I was staring directly into the hidden camera lens embedded in the smart glasses frame with no awareness whatsoever that he was being captured in high-definition video. The naked evil emanating from those dark, acquisitive eyes turned my stomach. He reached out and softly stroked Evelyn's hair, a grotesque parody of a son, comforting his mother in her final moments. I sat completely frozen in that small repair shop, fingernails biting deep into the armrests of the office chair, compelled to watch the precise moment my family was destroyed forever. Nate brought his face to within inches of the hidden microphone. His voice came out as a soft, lethal murmur that seemed to fill the entire silent room. "Sorry, Mom," he said, his tone smooth and unhurried, stripped of anything resembling a human soul. "I need the trust. Dad won't suspect a thing. He's too trusting." The video held on his cold, vacant smile for one more unbearable second. Then I heard it, the terrible, wet, rattling sound of my wife's last breath. The camera lurched slightly as her body went completely limp against the cold kitchen tiles, and the screen cut instantly to black. I sat in the dim, suffocating quiet of that cramped electronics shop. The harsh blue glow of the idle monitor threw long, hollow shadows across the scarred workbench. I did not scream, I did not weep, I did not collapse. The profound, crushing sorrow that had anchored my soul for 5 agonizing months simply ceased to exist. Within seconds, the raw, suffocating grief was incinerated, burned entirely away by a sudden, terrifying surge of weaponized fury. My mind, ordinarily given to structural mathematics and load calculations, locked into a state of absolute, ice-cold clarity. Nate had not merely stood by while his mother died. He had engineered her murder with cold deliberation, discarding her life-saving medication while looking straight into her eyes, all to accelerate his access to a trust he needed to cover his pathetic criminal debts. Beside me, the young technician was shaking violently. Eli was staring at the blank screen, face drained of all color, chest moving in short, terrified pulls of air. His hand reached out, trembling across the cluttered desk, fingers groping for his phone. "Mr. Vance," Eli stammered, his voice fracturing with panic. "We have to contact the police right now. We have to hand them this video. They'll arrest him tonight for murder." I extended a perfectly steady hand and closed my fingers around his trembling wrist. I pressed his hand gently away from the phone call, but with a grip that left no room for argument. "No, Eli," I said evenly, my voice carrying none of the frail, bewildered old man I had been performing for weeks. "We are not calling the local police. If we do that, they'll take Nate quietly from the comfort of his own home. He'll have expensive defense attorneys retained within hours. They will bury this video in procedural motions and challenge its authenticity. They'll push for a prolonged trial while he sits on bail, spending the very money he drained from my accounts. A quiet arrest is far too gentle for what he did to my wife." Eli swallowed hard, his eyes moving between the dark screen and my face. "Then what do you want to do?" he whispered. I rose from the chair, a sudden hard surge of adrenaline cutting through the thallium and sedatives still working through my system, the raw primal drive to destroy a predator temporarily overwhelming everything else. "Tomorrow evening is Nate's 35th birthday. I said, my voice flat and deliberate as I moved slowly across the narrow floor of the shop. "He's throwing himself a lavish, exclusive gala in the grand ballroom of the Bellevue Hotel downtown. Over 300 guests. His entire circle of wealthy investment banking colleagues will be there. The underground syndicate contacts he owes $15 million to will be there as well, dressed up as legitimate corporate investors. And the cruelest irony of all, he charged this entire extravagant celebration to my personal credit cards, all while boasting to his associates about his remarkable financial success." I stopped moving and looked directly at the young technician. "I am not going to let him hide behind closed doors," I said. "I am going to dismantle him in front of every single person he has spent his life trying to impress. His money, his freedom, his pristine public image, I am going to strip all of it away at the same moment. I want him humiliated, ruined, and cornered with nowhere left to run." Eli nodded slowly, dragging a hand across his forehead to clear the cold sweat. He turned back to his workstation. "Tell me exactly what you need," he said, his voice finding its footing again. "Export the fully restored decrypted video file right now," I told him, directing a firm finger at the monitor. "Render the highest resolution version onto a master USB drive. I want the audio crystal clear, every syllable of his confession perfectly audible. Make 2 secure backup copies and lock them in your shop vault. I'll take the master drive with me tonight." As Eli worked through the digital commands, running the footage through a rendering process to ensure the file was fully stable, I drew my encrypted phone from my jacket pocket. I pulled up my secure contacts and dialed Clifford Egan. The veteran attorney picked up immediately, his voice sharp and ready. "Harold," Clifford said briskly. "The cyber division just confirmed the wire transfer landed in the restricted honeypot account. Nate took the bait completely. The digital trap is locked." "That's good news, Clifford," I replied, my voice carrying the same cold precision as a steel mechanism closing under tension. "But the situation has moved beyond that. I'm at an electronics shop. I've just watched recovered footage from Evelyn's smart glasses. Nate and Iris murdered her, Clifford. They deliberately withheld her emergency heart medication and watched her die on the kitchen floor while he whispered about how much he needed the trust." A heavy, lethal silence settled over the encrypted line. When Clifford finally responded, his voice was a low, dangerous growl. I will personally see to it that he rots inside a federal cell for the remainder of his miserable life, the attorney promised. Give me the word, Harold. How do you want to deliver the final blow? Contact your lead agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now, I said calmly. Tell the cyber division we are moving up the timeline. I don't want anyone at my house tonight. Nate is hosting a major birthday gala at the Bellevue Hotel tomorrow evening at 8:00. His syndicate handlers will be in attendance. I want federal agents positioned and ready. I want every exit of that ballroom sealed. Consider it done, Clifford said without a pause. I'll have the federal tactical units staged in the hotel service corridors completely out of sight until you give the final signal. What's your plan with the video file? I watched Eli carefully eject a sleek USB drive from his computer tower and hold it out toward me. I took it and pressed it into the inner pocket of my jacket, resting my hand flat against the fabric for a moment. I'm going to give my son a birthday present he will never recover from, I told the attorney. Tomorrow night when he makes his toast, I will take over every screen in that room. He will lose everything all at once in front of everyone. Drop the hammer tonight. The following evening, I stood before the full-length mirror in my master bedroom and carefully straightened the silk lapels of my tailored charcoal tuxedo. For 5 months, I had practiced the humiliating posture of a dying, diminished man. The hunched shoulders, the shuffling gait, the trembling voice that performance was finished. I straightened to my full-height spine rigid as a load-bearing column, shoulders squared, jaw locked with the unyielding resolve of structural steel. I slipped the master USB drive into my inner breast pocket and let it settle directly over my heart. The cold, hard edge of the casing pressed there like a constant reminder of the devastation I was about to set in motion. I drove myself to the Bellevue Hotel. The previous night's rain had blown through, leaving the downtown streets gleaming and wet, the neon glow of the financial district fracturing across the slick pavement. I handed my keys to the valet with a calm, deliberate motion and pushed through the grand revolving doors into the lobby. The ballroom beyond was a monument to grotesque stolen excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests draped in designer gowns and bespoke suits. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, their music swallowed whole by the loud, self-satisfied chatter of investment bankers, corporate executives, and the quiet, dangerous men lurking at the edges, representatives of the violent underground syndicate. Nate had spared nothing, pouring my hard-earned money freely to project an image of untouchable financial supremacy. I stepped onto the thick ballroom carpet and swept the crowd with a predator's focused gaze. It didn't take long. Nate stood near an elaborate floral centerpiece, crystal flute of champagne in hand, laughing at something said by a man with cold, flat eyes and a tailored silk suit. Iris was draped elegantly on Nate's arm, wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost more than my first home. As I moved smoothly through the press of guests, my presence registered like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. No shuffle, no cough, just the heavy, undeniable authority of a man who held absolute command over the room he walked into. Iris spotted me first. The polished, practiced smile on her face locked up completely. Her perfectly manicured fingers clamped down on Nate's bicep. She leaned in and whispered something urgent into his ear. Nate turned his head. The laughter died in his throat on the spot. He stared at me, eyes widening with sheer, unguarded confusion. He had been expecting the frail, bewildered old man who had practically groveled for help in the study the previous afternoon, a victim sedated by a double dose of toxic tea, perhaps too impaired to even make it to the gala. What he was looking at instead was a formidable patriarch radiating icy, terrifying vitality. For one brief, unguarded moment, raw panic crossed his face. He hastily excused himself from the syndicate figures and nearly sprinted across the ballroom floor to cut me off before I could reach any of the wealthy guests. "Dad!" Nate gasped, his voice tight and breathless as he stepped directly into my path. "What are you doing walking around like this? You look so different today. Are you sure you should even be out of bed?" I looked him straight in the eyes and kept my gaze completely flat, stripped of every trace of paternal warmth. "I feel remarkably well tonight, Nate," I said, my voice carrying a deep, resonant steadiness that made him visibly flinch. "It is absolutely amazing what a single day of proper rest and a clear mind can do for a man's overall constitution. I would not miss your 35th birthday celebration for anything in the world." Nate swallowed hard, his Adam's apple working nervously above his silk bow tie. He searched my face with frantic eyes, hunting for any crack that might reveal what I knew, but my expression was an impenetrable wall of stone. He forced a stiff, awkward smile and decided to play along, driven by the urgent need to protect his financial position. "Well, I am incredibly glad you are feeling stronger," he murmured, leaning close and dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He glanced over his shoulder to confirm none of his high society guests or syndicate handlers were within earshot. He reached for my elbow, attempting to steer me toward a quiet alcove near the draped velvet curtains. I planted my feet and didn't move an inch. "Listen, Dad, I wanted to tell you the good news," Nate whispered urgently, his eyes lit with a sickening blend of greedy desperation and profound relief. "That dedicated trading account you set up for me yesterday, the $5 million. I successfully executed the initial transactions this morning. I moved the capital into a highly secure offshore investment portfolio. It is going to yield massive immediate returns for the family trust. You do not have to worry about a single financial burden ever again. I have completely taken care of everything." My stomach turned at the breathtaking audacity of it. He was standing right in front of me, openly boasting about federal wire fraud, utterly convinced he had successfully stolen my life savings to pay off the violent men hunting him. He believed he had outsmarted me, that he had secured his future, completely unaware that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already logged his illegal transfer, documented his digital fingerprints, and secured the necessary criminal warrants. I let out a slow, measured breath. I looked at the man who carried my last name. There was nothing left to salvage. Whatever biological bond had existed between us had been cleanly severed by his sociopathic greed. I reached out and placed a firm, heavy hand on his shoulder, gripping his expensive suit jacket and squeezing with enough sudden pressure to make him wince. "You have made your bed, son," I said quietly. The words were soft, but they landed with the devastating, irrevocable weight of a heavy iron gavel striking wood. Nate blinked, his brow creasing. "What does that mean, Dad?" I didn't offer him a single syllable of explanation. I released my grip, turned my back on him entirely, and walked away, leaving him standing alone beside the velvet curtains. I moved through the crowded room with purpose, gliding past the chandeliers, the lavish buffet tables, and the armed syndicate enforcers lurking in the shadows. My destination was the primary audiovisual control booth, tucked out of sight behind a row of tall floral arrangements. I stepped through the thick black curtains and pushed open the soundproof door. Eli was seated motionless, inside his face lit by the harsh blue glow of a master control laptop. He had on a simple black catering uniform, entirely invisible as a technical assistant. I quietly placed the loaded digital flash drive in his hand. Eli took it, inserted it directly into the master input port of the central broadcasting console. A glowing green light pulsed softly, confirming the lethal payload was primed and locked into the hotel's audiovisual network. I gave the young technician a single nod of gratitude, then slipped back through the velvet curtains. The roar of the grand ballroom washed over me again, a chaotic symphony of clinking crystal-loud jazz and the hollow laughter of the corrupt. I moved across the crowded floor with steady steps, ignoring the curious glances of corporate associates who recognized me but couldn't quite read what they were seeing. I made my way to the primary VIP table positioned at the front of the massive stage. It was draped in white silk and lined with towering arrangements of orchids. I took my assigned seat, sitting perfectly upright in the gilded chair, smoothing the lapels of my tuxedo with deliberate, icy composure. To my left sat a row of influential bank executives, men who managed billions and held the local financial sector in their grip. To my right sat a terrifyingly quiet group in dark suits who did not smile, did not mingle, and drank their expensive liquor with cold, calculating eyes. These were the senior representatives of the underground criminal syndicate, the ruthless debt collectors Nate had desperately attempted to pay off just hours earlier using my isolated honeypot account. They sat comfortably out in the open, fully convinced their $15 million extortion had gone through without a hitch. I studied their hard faces and felt a quiet, satisfying thrill, knowing that Federal Bureau of Investigation tactical units were already positioned silently in the service corridors behind the kitchen, waiting patiently for my signal. Then the jazz trio stopped playing. The chandeliers dimmed sharply, sending a dramatic spotlight cutting down onto the center of the polished wooden stage. A hushed, expectant silence swept rapidly across the ballroom as the 300 assembled guests turned their attention forward. Nate stepped confidently into that bright circle of light crystal flute of sparkling champagne raised in his right hand. He looked absolutely radiant, the living portrait of youthful success. The bespoke suit draped his frame without a crease, the fabric shimmering under the stage lighting as he swept the room with a broad, practiced grin. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Nate said, his voice riding the sound system with a warmth that was entirely engineered. He let the applause roll in, received it with a modest tilt of his head, then resumed. "To stand before this many extraordinary people, friends, partners, on the occasion of my 35th birthday is something I will carry for the rest of my life. This past year we hit milestones nobody thought achievable. We held steady through brutal market conditions, absorbed volatility that broke other firms, and assembled portfolios that will protect everyone in this room for decades. But that isn't what I'm really here to talk about tonight." He moved to the front edge of the stage with a measured, deliberate step, his register dropping to something quieter, almost confessional, the move of a man who had rehearsed compassion until it looked instinctive. I was playing this crowd the way a surgeon works a scalpel, clean, precise, deadly. What matters tonight is the bedrock beneath all of it. It is the question of what grounds a man, what holds him upright when the markets close and the office empties. It comes down to family, to the sacrifices of the people who laid the foundation long before any of us took credit for standing on it. He swung his gaze toward my table and pressed an open palm to his chest directly above the heart that had never functioned like one. As most of you know, this year took something from us that cannot be recovered. 5 months ago, he continued, his voice hitching on cue with a flawless simulation of grief, we lost my mother, Evelyn. She was the compass the whole family navigated by, steady, generous, irreplaceable. The kind of woman who showed you what patience and love actually look like in practice, not in theory. The space she left behind is not something you fill. You learn to move around it. Not a morning goes by that I don't see her smile. Not a night ends without her voice somewhere in my head. Every transaction I close, every partnership I build, it's done in her name. A ripple of audible emotion moved through the crowd, not manufactured this time, but real. I cut my eyes sideways. Iris was seated at the neighboring table, pressing a delicate lace handkerchief to the corner of one eye, with the practiced precision of a trained actress manufacturing sorrow she had never once actually felt. The muscles in my jaw locked hard, watching the two of them perform their coordinated theater, weaponizing the very death they had engineered, ignited something in my chest that ran hotter than rage. They were harvesting sympathy from a room full of people who had no idea they were watching murderers take a bow. And I would be remiss, Nate went on, his voice thickening with a masterfully deployed filial tremor as he extended his arm in my direction, if I did not acknowledge my father, Harold, the man who drew the blueprints for everything our family has built. You can see for yourselves that this past year has weighed heavily on him. Watching someone you love diminish, watching the strongest person you've ever known struggle under the weight of grief is a particular kind of pain. But Dad, I'm saying this in front of every person in this room. The load is mine to carry now. Your legacy is safe. Lean on me and rest. The ballroom detonated in applause. The guests came to their feet, genuinely stirred by the portrait he had painted, the selfless son, the ailing patriarch, the dynasty passing from one generation to the next. Along the right flank of the room, the syndicate men stayed seated but lifted their glasses toward the stage in a slow, wordless salute to the man who had just wired them their millions. I kept my hands flat on the cool silk cloth and did not move a muscle. I held my focus on the creature at that microphone, and I poured everything, every last degree of my cold, weaponized fury into the blankest, most impenetrable face I owned. Nate soaked in the applause with a gracious smile. When it finally ebbed, he raised his flute once more. Before we bring out the main course and close this evening properly, Nate announced, his voice bright and ringing through the speakers, I want to offer something more personal than a toast, a tribute. Please turn your attention to the screen behind me, a short film I've put together for the woman who made me who I am, my mother. He turned and gestured upward toward the 20-foot projector screen suspended above the stage. Every light in the room dropped at once, dropping the ballroom into total theatrical black. The crowd quieted, completely rustling into expectant stillness, ready for a curated parade of family photographs set to soft music. My hand slid slowly beneath the tablecloth. I found the cold plastic casing of the device Eli had placed in my care. My thumb settled over the single transmission button and pressed down. The signal went to Eli. The hammer was released. In the darkness, the massive screen shuddered and came alive. Nate was still standing on the polished stage, that smug, proprietary expression locked in place, his flute raised for a toast to a woman he had helped destroy. 300 guests settled in their gilded seats, eyes forward, anticipating a sentimental montage, curated nostalgia assembled to burnish Nate's reputation as a loving son. What hit the screen instead was a violent burst of digital static, jagged and unhinged. A high-pitched screech blew through the speakers, hard enough to suck the air out of the room. The screen splintered into corrupted data before the image slammed into brutal, unambiguous focus. What appeared was a raw, ground-level, first-person view, disorienting, immediate, inescapable. It was the restored visual feed directly from my beautiful wife's damaged smart glasses. At that scale, 20 feet across, there was nowhere to look away. Evelyn's hands filled the screen, reaching to pour a glass of water in our kitchen, the light warm and ordinary around her. Her humming drifted through the subwoofers, that soft melody threading itself into every corner of the opulent room with an intimacy that made the silence around it unbearable. 5 seconds passed. Nobody breathed. Then the feed broke apart. The image lurched sideways at a nauseating angle and a gasp tore through the ballroom. Not one voice, but the whole room amplified and reflected back by the sound system into something enormous. The drinking glass exploded across the kitchen floor with a concussive crack that hit the assembled guests like a physical blow. They recoiled in their seats, bodies registering the shock before their minds caught up. The camera plunged downward as Evelyn's body struck the tiles. Her hands, vast and terrible, on the projection pressed against her own sternum. Every breath she drew was audible through the crystal-clear audio feed, shallow-labored, each one costing more than the last. The thallium was already deep in her system, tearing through her cardiovascular function in real time. A woman in the front row pressed her fingers over her mouth to hold in the sound she was making. The bankers and the syndicate men had turned to stone. "Nate, my wife," Evelyn wheezed from the speakers, her voice stripped raw with terror. "Iris, please help me." A pair of sleek designer heels stepped into the frame from the side. The camera dragged upward to find Iris standing over her dying mother-in-law with a ceramic coffee mug in one hand and a face carved from absolute indifference. "Iris!" Evelyn choked out her arm, lifting fingers reaching shaking toward the woman above her. "My pills, on the counter, please. It is my heart. I cannot breathe at all." 300 people held themselves motionless as Iris bent down on the massive screen. They watched her close her hand around the bright orange prescription bottle. They watched her fingers work the child-proof cap off with smooth, unhurried precision. No hesitation, no conflict, nothing. A collective shudder moved through the crowd as Iris crossed to the sink. The speakers delivered the sound in full, the hard rattle of life-saving pills cascading down a metal drain and then the rush of tap water driving them the rest of the way, erasing Evelyn's last chance at survival with the same detachment you'd use to rinse a coffee cup. A sick, low noise began building at the back of the ballroom. Disgust, formless at first, then gaining shape as it spread forward through the guests. But the recording had not reached its conclusion. A second set of footsteps entered the kitchen, heavier, deliberate. Nate walked into the center of that 20-foot frame. He folded himself down beside Iris and leaned his face close to his mother's. Magnified to monstrous scale across the full backdrop of the stage, his expression was something the people in that room would not soon forget. The opulence around them seemed to cool by 10 degrees as they stared into it. He brushed Evelyn's hair back from her face, a tender gesture that landed like a desecration, and brought his mouth close to the hidden microphone woven into the frame of her glasses. "Sorry, Mom," Nate whispered. The audio system had no mercy. Those two words detonated across the ballroom with perfect digital clarity, bouncing off marble and glass and the stricken faces of 300 witnesses. "I need the trust. Dad won't suspect a thing. He's too trusting." The entire ballroom seemed to drop away beneath the crowd as though the floor itself had given out. That cold, vacant smile held on the massive screen for one final, unbearable moment. Then the speakers carried it, the wet, rattling sound of my wife's last desperate breath. The camera shuddered as her body went slack against the kitchen tiles and the screen snapped to absolute black. 3 seconds of suffocating silence pressed down on every person in that room. The scale of what they had witnessed had turned the crowd to stone. Then the chandeliers blazed back on, flooding the ballroom with a hard, unsparing light that felt like a verdict. The spell broke apart under it. Nate's grip failed him, the crystal flute slipped from his fingers and exploded against the polished stage floor in a bright spray of fragments. The crack of it rang across the room like a starter's pistol. That sound opened the floodgates. Iris let out a piercing, hysterical scream, staggering backward from the stage with both hands clamped over her head. The distinguished crowd fractured into uproar, outrage, pouring from the executives in hot, aggressive waves, disgusted whispers escalating rapidly into accusations shouted across tables. The syndicate men rose from their seats with a slow, deliberate menace, their dead eyes fixing on Nate with an intention that needed no words. They had just done the arithmetic. Their $15 million debtor wasn't a financial mastermind. He was an exposed killer whose next address would be a federal holding cell. Nate stood marooned at center stage as his entire constructed world collapsed around him. Every drop of color had evacuated his face, leaving something gray and clammy in its place. His jaw worked without producing language, the gears of his deception spinning uselessly, finding no purchase. The evidence on that screen had been irrefutable. There was no angle left to play. His panicked gaze swept the erupting room in search of something solid to hold on to. It found me. I was seated at the VIP table, completely still, spine straight, both hands resting in my lap. No flinching, no outrage on my face. Nothing at all, just the flat, unwavering stare of a man who had engineered every second of this moment. As Nate looked into my eyes across that roaring room, something cracked open behind his own. He no longer saw the doddering, pliable old man he had been manipulating for months. What he saw instead was the architect, the engineer who had taken his entire scheme apart bolt by bolt and rebuilt it as a trap. The blood left his lips as the full shape of it landed on him. I had been there the whole time. Every shuffling step, every quavering answer, every cup of poisoned tea endured, all of it had been deliberate. He had walked himself into the center of my design. For 5 months I had absorbed the role of victim and built the structure around him in silence. Now the steel jaws were closed and I was going to watch him lose every last thing he had taken from others to protect. The FBI tactical teams positioned in the service corridors were nearly ready to move. The weight pressing on the ballroom finally gave way all at once. Nate wrenched his eyes from mine. His chest convulsed with ragged, heaving breaths as the scaffolding of his fabricated life came down around him. He lurched backward across the stage, his expensive shoes skating on the lacquered wood. He caught the podium on his way past, dragging it down with him. The microphone hit the stage with a shriek of feedback that drove hands over ears throughout the room. "It's a deep fake," Nate screamed, his voice fracturing into a register he couldn't control. His arms flailed toward the darkened projector screen above him. "It's a manufactured lie. My father has severe dementia. He is not mentally competent. He paid technicians to fabricate that footage and ruin my name. Not one frame of that video is real. It is a delusion dressed up as evidence." But the room gave him nothing back. No murmur of doubt. No sympathetic face to anchor himself to. The executives, the bankers, the syndicate representatives, all of them regarded him with the same expression, contempt shading into something colder and more predatory. They had heard the pills. They had heard the confession captured without distortion and broadcast at concert volume. They were looking at a man who had poisoned his own mother for the terms of a legal trust, and they knew it with the certainty of people who had just watched it happen. The recognition that he had lost the room hit Nate like a structural failure, sudden and total. His sweat-slicked face swung from side to side as his eyes mapped the room for exits. The main entrance was swallowed by the crowd guests pressing inward rather than clearing space. That left one option, the double-service doors at the far end of the venue behind the catering corridor. Nate threw himself off the stage. He landed on the carpet with a heavy, graceless thud and broke into a desperate sprint toward the back of the room. Iris screamed again, gathering fistfuls of her glittering gown and lurching after him, her diamond necklace whipping against her collarbone, her stiletto heels barely finding the floor beneath her. "Wait!" she sobbed, her voice cutting high and raw over the noise of the crowd. "Nate, don't leave me here. Wait for me." The 300 guests recoiled ahead of them as they ran, not out of deference but revulsion. The crowd parted the way a body rejects something foreign, creating a wide, empty channel of shame between the fleeing couple and the kitchen doors. No hand reached out. No voice offered them anything. Just a corridor of turned backs and appalled faces opening all the way to the exit. I watched their flight from where I stood, cold, steady, constructed. I pushed back from the VIP table and rose to my full height, spine-locked weight evenly distributed, the posture of a man who had not been frail a single day. I moved across the floor at a measured pace, the crowd parting without my asking. I reached the fallen podium, bent at the knee, and lifted the microphone from the stage floor. 2 sharp taps against the mesh head. The sound boomed out of the speakers and silenced the room in an instant. The shouting collapsed into a weighted quiet, the kind that precedes a verdict. I surveyed the faces spread before me, and then I spoke. My voice had nothing in common with the thin, uncertain instrument I had performed with for 5 months. "What you witnessed on that screen was not a fabrication," I said, the words carrying cleanly to every corner of the ballroom. It was the final minutes of my wife's life recorded without her knowledge by the hidden technology in her own eyewear. And their ambition did not stop with her. For 5 months following her death, Nate and Iris have been introducing a concentrated sedative compound into my food and drink inside my own home, specifically into the herbal tea they prepared for me daily in order to manufacture the appearance of advanced cognitive decline. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tuxedo and drew out the toxicology report the independent laboratory had completed that afternoon. I held it up so the room could see it. "This is a full toxicological analysis conducted by an accredited independent facility earlier today," I stated, my voice cutting through the air without a tremor. "It confirms that the tea served to me contained a concentrated dose of thallium, a heavy metal poison with no taste and no odor, engineered to dismantle the nervous system and trigger a fatal cardiac event. They killed Evelyn to gain accelerated control of a substantial family trust. And they were midway through killing me to cover $15 million in offshore gambling debts." A sharp collective intake of breath moved through the audience like a current. The syndicate men exchanged glances loaded with dark calculation, and hands drifted quietly toward the interior of tailored jackets. On the far side of the room, Nate had nearly reached the heavy double kitchen doors. His palm found the brass handle. His body was already pitching forward, every instinct screaming at him to get through and disappear into the service corridors beyond. He drove the door open with his full remaining weight. The door swung inward, but Nate did not take a single step forward. He ran straight into a wall of dark tactical armor. A dozen high-powered flashlight beams cut through the dim room in an instant, pinning his sweat-soaked, terrified face in their glare. A full FBI tactical unit, heavily armed Kevlar vests blazing with bright yellow lettering, had sealed off the kitchen threshold completely. They pressed forward into the grand ballroom in tight, disciplined formation, locking down the only viable exit behind them. Iris crashed into Nate's back with a breathless shriek as the agents fanned out weapons-raised faces hidden behind dark helmets and ballistic visors. From the core of that federal formation, a familiar figure stepped forward into the warmth of the chandeliers. Clifford Egan, my ruthless estate attorney, straightened his immaculate black suit jacket with a casual adjustment of the lapels, his predatory gaze settling directly on my trembling son. He held a thick official federal warrant in his right hand. I stood at the front of the stage, watching my expression, a cold mask of calculated victory, and I lowered the microphone just long enough to offer Nate a dark, merciless smile. The trap we had built in silence had closed with bone-crushing finality. There was no exit left. The ballroom detonated into chaos the moment those federal boots crossed the threshold. The tactical unit moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. No shouted commands, no weapons waved at the panicked guests. They advanced in a locked, purposeful column directly toward the stage, heavy boots striking the polished floor in unison. The high society crowd scrambled out of their path in a blind rush, upending champagne flutes and sending elaborate arrangements crashing to the ground. Nate stood frozen at the edge of the stage. Every impulse toward flight had drained out of him, replaced by the suffocating weight of what he now understood was inescapable. He watched the dark uniforms close in with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth working silently, producing nothing. Two agents hit the stage steps at speed and were on him before he could register their movement. They took him by the shoulders of his custom tuxedo and drove him face first into the nearest silk-draped banquet table. Silverware and china scattered across the floor with a crash. Nate let out a sharp-winded gasp as the agent's combined weight pinned him hard against the white tablecloth. His arms were hauled behind his back. The cold metallic ratchet of steel handcuffs locking into place rang out over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. "Nate Vance," the lead agent announced, his voice a deep baritone that filled the room without effort. "You are under arrest by order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are being charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and federal wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The weight of those charges descended on the ballroom like a wall of ice water. First-degree murder. The words moved through the assembled bankers and executives in a whispered current, their faces cycling from disbelief into something rawer and more visceral. The flawless public persona Nate had spent years engineering was being dismantled in front of his entire professional world piece by piece in real time. Then a piercing, hysterical shriek split the air. Iris had managed to break away from the agents blocking the kitchen exit, but her freedom lasted seconds. Two female federal agents intercepted her, grabbing her bare arms and spinning her around hard. She fought them, the layered skirt of her designer gown tangling around her legs as she twisted against their grip. "I did not do anything!" Iris screamed, her voice disintegrating with raw panic. Her carefully styled hair was plastered in damp strands across her face, the image of polished aristocracy completely demolished. She wrenched her neck to find Nate still pinned against the banquet table and jabbed a shaking finger in his direction. "It was all his idea," she wailed. "He forced me into it. I told me he would leave me with nothing if I didn't help him with the medication. He is a monster. He is a degenerate gambling addict. You have to believe me. I am the victim here." The betrayal was instantaneous and total. The moment her own freedom hung in the balance, she fed the man she supposedly loved to whatever consumed him. Nate turned his head against the crushed silk tablecloth and looked at his screaming wife with an expression of pure, shattered disbelief. The agents paid no attention to her performance. They pulled her arms behind her back and closed a matching pair of handcuffs over her wrists with the same mechanical efficiency. She kept sobbing, the theatrical tears long gone now, replaced by the ugly, genuine weeping of a cornered criminal watching a life built on stolen wealth come apart for good. As the agents secured both prisoners, Clifford Egan stepped onto the wooden stage. He moved with the measured, unhurried ease of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular moment. He picked up the discarded metallic microphone from the floor, dusted off the mesh head, and turned to face the stunned audience. His sharp gaze made a slow, deliberate circuit of the room, pausing with intent on the quiet table occupied by the syndicate representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Clifford said, his voice carrying a cold, unwavering authority, I apologize for the disruption to this evening's program, but certain facts require clarification for everyone present. The $5 million wire transfer executed earlier today by Mr. Nate Vance was not a corporate investment of any kind. It was a carefully monitored federal sting operation. He let that land before continuing. The account Mr. Vance accessed was a restricted federal honeypot. By routing those funds to unverified offshore entities in a bid to cover his illegal gambling debts, he handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a complete digital blueprint of his illicit financial network. As of this moment, every offshore account connected to that fraudulent transfer has been frozen and seized by international authorities. I watched the syndicate table carefully. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Postures that had been loose and arrogant tightened into something coiled and dangerous. The calculation behind their eyes shifted from cold confidence to something much closer to dread. They understood now Nate hadn't just failed to deliver their $15 million. He had walked a federal task force directly through the front door of their hidden financial infrastructure. Their money was gone and their entire covert operation had been laid bare. Their eyes found Nate across the room, and the message in them required no translation. Clifford set the microphone down and signaled the tactical unit forward. The lead agent hauled Nate to his feet by the collar, and they began the march across the ballroom floor toward the main exit. The crowd drew back without a word, heads turning away, no one willing to make eye contact with the man they had been toasting 20 minutes earlier. As the agents brought Nate past my VIP table, his legs gave out completely. The full reality of what was happening buckled him, and he went down hard to both knees on the carpet, dragging the agent sideways with his weight. He looked up at me from the floor, his face wet with genuine terrified tears. The untouchable investment banker, the man who had laughed at an elaborate floral centerpiece with criminal syndicate figures not an hour ago, was gone. In his place was something broken and small. His whole life, he now understood, was over. He opened his mouth and begged me for a mercy he had never once extended to Evelyn. Dad, please. The syndicate will kill me in prison. You have to save me. I am your son. I looked down at the man kneeling on that carpet. His custom tuxedo was ruined. His body shook. The tears running down his face had nothing to do with grief for the mother he had poisoned and nothing to do with guilt for what he had put our family through. They were the tears of a cornered narcissist who had finally met the limit of his own cunning, a predator reduced to prey, begging for a lifeline. He called on the bond he had deliberately destroyed 5 months ago as though it might still hold weight. I stood over him and felt something I had not expected, a profound, hollow emptiness. No flood of triumph, no desire to scream or to raise a hand against him. I wasn't worth the fuel it would take to burn. The toxic fury that had kept me upright through 5 months of playing a diminished old man had burned itself out completely, leaving behind nothing but cold, clean resolve. What I saw kneeling on that carpet was a hollow vessel greed wearing the shape of a sun. The federal agents held him in place. Clifford stood to the side in silence, watching the end of the thing we had spent months constructing. The entire ballroom held itself rigid, braced for an explosive confrontation. Instead, I bent my knees and lowered myself until my face was inches from Nate's. His eyes jumped with a pitiful, desperate flicker of hope, the irrational belief that a father's love might somehow outweigh premeditated murder. I looked into those eyes and searched for any remnant of the child I had once known. There was nothing, an absolute void looking back. I let out one slow, measured breath, feeling the full weight of finality settle into place. I'm just a clueless old man, Nate, I whispered low enough that only he could hear. I don't know who you are. The hope drained from his face in an instant, replaced by a horror he had no language for. His mouth fell open. No sound came out. He understood it then, the full, perfect shape of the trap. I had handed him back his own words, the exact phrase he had spoken in his office when he believed I was too sedated and too broken to register his intentions. I straightened up, broke eye contact, and turned my back on the man who had once carried my name. No! Nate screamed, the sound wrenched from somewhere deep and animal. Dad, please don't walk away. You cannot leave me like this. They will kill me. I did not slow my pace. I moved toward the main exit of the grand ballroom with heavy, measured steps, completely unmoved by the chaos collapsing behind me. The crowd of wealthy guests, executives, and stunned socialites drew back as I approached, their expressions a mixture of deep shock and something closer to silent, involuntary respect. Not one of them spoke. The syndicate men remained frozen at their table, their cold eyes tracking my exit, fully grasping the scope of the federal net that had just come down on everything they had built. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the Bellevue Hotel and stepped out into the cool night air. The rain was long gone, leaving the city streets dark and slick and clean. The neon glow of the financial district shimmered in the shallow puddles on the pavement. For the first time in 5 grinding months, I drew a breath with nothing pressing down on it. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not drag my feet. I stood tall, the oppressive weight of my manufactured weakness permanently lifted from my tired bones. Behind me, the muffled wail of approaching police sirens started to build in the distance, a fitting score for the final demolition of Nate's stolen world. The legal aftermath was swift and without mercy. The federal prosecutors extended no plea arrangements, no quiet resolutions. The evidence we had built was simply too dense, too airtight for any judicial softening. The digital confession captured by Evelyn's smart glasses, layered against the toxicology documentation and the thoroughly logged financial fraud, assembled into a case that left no seams. Nate and Iris had planned to draw on the family trust to retain the most aggressive defense attorneys available. They had expected to litigate, endlessly burying the prosecution under years of procedural delay. But because Clifford and I had moved to freeze and seize every financial asset they held hours before the gala, they surfaced on the other side of that night with nothing. Every dollar of the wealth they had killed to obtain was gone. Without that money to fund a defense, their high-priced legal representation dissolved. Their wealthy social circle discarded them overnight, treating them as something contagious, the same people who had raised glasses in their honor just days before. The trial was brief, clinical, and devastating. The prosecution played Evelyn's final moments for the jury, the sight of Iris pouring life-saving medication down the kitchen drain while Nate crouched over his dying mother and whispered his intentions. That footage closed the case before it had time to breathe. The jury was out for less than a single afternoon. When the verdict came, there were no dramatic outbursts, only the clean, heavy fall of the judge's gavel. Nate and Iris each received consecutive life sentences in maximum security federal prison with no possibility of parole. They would live out the remainder of their days in concrete cells, stripped of the designer clothes, the stolen luxury, and the arrogant freedom they had murdered to obtain. The syndicate fared no better. The $5 million wire transfer Nate had routed into my monitored honeypot account gave the Federal Bureau of Investigation the exact digital keys required to crack the entire criminal network open. The transaction logs were used to systematically trace, freeze, and seize dozens of hidden offshore accounts. The dangerous men who had confidently attended the gala to collect their extortion money were aggressively hunted down and arrested within weeks. Their empire was dismantled, their assets seized, and the threat they represented was effectively neutralized. Now, sitting alone in the quiet warmth of my study, I look at the framed photograph of Evelyn on my mahogany desk. The heavy, suffocating darkness that had pressed down on this past year has begun at last to draw back, replaced by something quieter and more durable. The house is still, but it no longer feels entirely empty. I honored her memory the only way that truly counted. I protected what we built together, and I made certain the people who took her from me faced the full weight of what they had done. I came through the darkest storm I have ever known, and I came through it standing. The trap is closed. The board is clear. Justice, cold and absolute, has been served. 6 months passed with the swift, relentless momentum of a world that had finally righted itself. The hard grip of winter gave way entirely to a bright and open spring, and something inside me gave way with it. I stood quietly beneath the morning sun, head tilted back, looking up at the sleek glass facade of the newly expanded Philadelphia General Medical Center. A crisp breeze moved across the lapels of my dark suit, but I felt no chill. I felt only a deep, radiating warmth anchoring my soul to the ground. This was the day everything I had fought for came into physical form. A small, composed gathering of hospital administrators, senior cardiovascular surgeons, and dedicated medical staff stood near the main entrance around a polished marble podium. A wide crimson silk ribbon stretched across the gleaming automatic doors. At my right hand stood Clifford, my steadfast attorney, holding the leather folio with the finalized trust documents. We had successfully converted the entire $40 million family fund, moved it permanently beyond the blood-stained reach of my disgraced son into this. Every dollar redirected, every cent accounted for. The hospital director stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. He spoke about the lives this facility would save, the advanced surgical theaters, the research laboratories now fully operational, the scope of what had become possible. He spoke about the generosity that had made this a reality rather than a proposal. The applause moved respectfully through the crowd, but my attention was elsewhere. My eyes were fixed on the heavy bronze plaque bolted into the granite wall beside the entrance, the Evelyn Vance Cardiology Wing. The letters caught the morning light and held it. I reached out and traced the engraved outline of her name with my fingertips. A wave of completion moved through me, not triumph, not relief exactly, but something deeper and more permanent than either. Evelyn had suffered in her final moments, betrayed by the very people she had given her love to without reservation. Her failing heart had been ignored deliberately, callously for the sake of an inheritance. Now her name would be attached to healing, to intervention, to the preservation of life permanently and without condition. I held the faint smile that rose in me. It was genuine. It was the first one in over a year that felt entirely free. The legacy we had built together was secure beyond the reach of greed or corruption. I took the golden scissors the director placed in my hand and cut cleanly through the crimson ribbon. The crowd broke into warm, genuine applause. The wing was open. The long shadow of Nate's crime was eclipsed finally permanently by this monument of enduring light. After the brief reception wound down, I politely declined Clifford's offer of a ride and decided to walk the 2 miles back to my estate. My body welcomed the effort. My legs, which I had compelled to drag and shuffle through 5 grinding months of performance, now moved with long, purposeful, and deliberate strides. My spine held perfectly straight. My breathing was deep and steady, pulling in the clean, uncontaminated air of the city. Every trace of the physical frailty I had so painstakingly performed was gone, replaced by a robust, undeniable vitality that made a mockery of my age. I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street, the familiar silhouette of my large stone house rising into view. When I turned the key in the heavy oak front door and crossed into the grand foyer, the immediate silence of an empty house met me. But it was no longer the suffocating, coiled silence of a home sheltering dangerous predators. It was a clean, honest, and deeply comforting quiet. The toxic presence of Nate and Iris had been entirely eradicated from these walls, scoured away by the absolute finality of their federal convictions. I moved slowly through the spacious living room, letting my fingertips trail across the polished mahogany furniture. I drifted toward the sunlit corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hideous, drooping Boston fern that had served as the secret burial ground for my daily doses of poisoned medication was long gone. I had personally bagged the contaminated soil and hurled the heavy ceramic pot into the municipal dumpster months before. In its place stood a vibrant, thriving yellow rose, its petals glowing warmly in the natural light. It was Evelyn's favorite flower, a living testament to her enduring presence in this house. I continued into the kitchen, the very room where Nate had coldly watched his mother draw her final breath. The horrific echoes of that day had been methodically displaced by the quiet, ordinary rhythms of a restored life. I filled the copper kettle with fresh filtered water and set it on the gas stove. I lit the burner, watching the bright blue flame leap to life. I pulled open the wooden pantry and took out a simple unbranded box of peppermint tea. I did not need to examine the contents. I did not need to secretly drain the liquid into the roots of a dying houseplant. The shrill whistle of the kettle cut through the serene quiet. I poured the boiling water into a porcelain mug, watching the liquid steep to a perfect depth of color. I lifted the warm mug and took a long, unhurried sip. It tasted pure, soothing, and completely safe. I carried my tea into the master study and settled into my heavy leather armchair. I gazed out the window at the manicured back lawn, feeling the sharp, unclouded clarity of my own mind. My cognitive functions were razor sharp. My body was healthy, strong, and entirely free of the heavy metal poisons that had very nearly taken my life. I had looked directly into the terrifying abyss of my own family's betrayal, and I had come out the other side completely victorious. The board was not merely cleared, it had been rebuilt from the ground up on my own unyielding terms. I closed my eyes and let the warm sunlight wash across my face. I could almost feel Evelyn's gentle hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. Her spirit, long restless under the weight of the brutal injustice of her passing, was finally at peace. And that is where the story ends, not in a courtroom, not in an argument, but in a quiet room with a cup of tea I could finally trust, and a name carved permanently into the walls of Philadelphia General Medical Center for the whole world to see. What this road cost me is not something I measure lightly. I lost months of my health, the illusion of a family I thought I knew, and the kind of innocence that never fully comes back. But I believe God does not allow a man to be brought that low without a reason. The Lord's timing gave me what no amount of rushing could have: the evidence, the patience, and the moment to let the truth speak louder than any accusation ever could. If these grandpa revenge stories have taught me anything worth passing along, here it is. Never let grief make you careless. The people who mean you harm are counting on your sorrow to blind you. If someone is controlling what you eat, what you know, and who you speak to, that is not love, that is a cage. Recognize it early. Document everything. A record kept in silence is worth more than a confrontation made in anger. And when justice finally comes, let it be bigger than your pain. Redirect it toward something that lasts. These father stories matter because they remind us that wisdom is not weakness and patience is not surrender. If this one moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments, I read every one. And if you are not yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, now is a good time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay sharp.